The most popular video on my channel is the one about where I discuss the differences between Sauron and Morgoth. An interesting thing about that video, to this day I still get people commenting on it saying Morgoth was chaotic evil, Sauron was neutral, lawful evil. And while it's certainly true that Sauron was nowhere near as chaotic evil as Morgoth, he definitely still had moments of exceptional cruelty and heartlessness that would have impressed his former master. So in this video, let's talk about some of Sauron's most evil moments. So it should come as no surprise that Sauron was responsible for a lot of deaths. He was the second Dark Lord of Middle-earth after all. He didn't conquer all those lands peacefully, he didn't send out his armies to make friends. All of those wars and battles he was responsible for, those deaths were entirely on him. But rather morbidly, a significant portion of the deaths Sauron was responsible for did not come as a result of his armies marching into battle. No, a lot of those deaths actually came from something far more insidious, something that can only be described as biological warfare. The event I'm describing is the Great Plague, of course. This first appeared in the Westlands of Middle-earth in Rhovanion in the winter of 1635. By the end of the next year, it had travelled all through Gondor and even reached distant Arnor in the north. By 1637, it was gone, but the damage was immense. Rhovanion lost half of its population. Gondor didn't fare as badly thanks to their more advanced arts of healing, but nevertheless a large portion of the population died and Osgiliath was depopulated. In the north, Minhiriath was left deserted, the remnants of Cardolan were destroyed, and the hobbits of the Shire suffered greatly. Only a few places escaped unscathed, or with only few deaths. But I'm only describing a part of the destruction, because the Great Plague didn't start in Rhovanion, it started in Rhûn, in the distant east, lands that were mostly dominated by Sauron, lived in by peoples who were his most devout followers. So instead of unleashing the Great Plague directly into his enemies, Sauron tested it out amongst his own subjects, or at the very least, allowed it to spread entirely unchecked. So even though Sauron achieved his goal of greatly weakening the men in the Westlands, he did so at the cost of sacrificing a huge amount of his own followers too. In the aftermath of the Great Plague, it was said that Gondor only survived because its enemies had been just as ravaged. Now, to be fair, we don't know for certain that Sauron was behind the Great Plague. Gondorian scholars seem to think so, and given how badly it weakened his enemies, Sauron did have a lot to gain. Plagues certainly weren't beyond the power of Dark Lords. Morgoth unleashed one in the First Age, so Sauron most likely would have had the capability. The only question is, considering how effective it was, why didn't Sauron unleash another? Perhaps it was beyond his power to do it again, but if we dare to dream, perhaps after seeing the damage it caused to his own followers, maybe Sauron decided to put it aside as a weapon. Maybe, but probably not. Of course, creating a bioweapon that kills hundreds of thousands or even millions is one thing. You're just pressing the button, you're not personally killing every single person, right? Well, Sauron was also capable of being extremely cruel in person, even in the First Age, before he was considered irredeemably evil. Thus, this brings us to the tale of Gorlim the Unhappy. He was a member of Barahir's band of outlaws, who operated in the land of Dorthonion after it was conquered by Morgoth's forces. This outlaw band was such a hindrance to Morgoth that he eventually sent Sauron to deal with it. So it was that Sauron learned that one of Barahir's outlaws, Gorlim, had a weakness. Gorlim would visit his old home every once in a while in order to search for his missing wife, Eilenel. One day, Gorlim returns home and thinks that he sees his wife in the window. It's a trap and he's captured. To his credit, Gorlim refuses to share any secrets about Barahir's band, but eventually his torturers bring up his wife and Gorlim falters. He's brought before Sauron and Sauron asks for Gorlim's price. Gorlim wishes to be reunited with his wife and they are to be set free. Sauron agrees, and Gorlim spills the information, and then Sauron laughs. He mocks Gorlim, saying that the Eilenel he had seen in the window was just a phantom that he had conjured, and that the real Eilenel was dead, possibly implying that he may have had a hand in her death, considering he knew what she looked like. Sauron then says, "Nonetheless, I will grant thy prayer, and thou shalt go to Eilenel, and be set free of my service." He then has Gorlim executed, and thanks to Gorlim's information, Barahir's band is then destroyed, except for Beren. While it's logical that Sauron would have Gorlim executed, it's the manner in which he goes about it that reveals a particularly cruel streak in Sauron's personality beyond the regular Dark Lord things. He uses Gorlim's grief and love for his wife as a way to exploit him, and when Gorlim falls for the trap, he doesn't just have the decency to kill him. Instead, he mocks him, revealing the truth and giving Gorlim enough time to process it all. Gorlim then has to die, not only knowing that his wife was dead the whole time, but also knowing that he has betrayed his friends for nothing. The fact that Sauron laughed at all this shows that it wasn't just business for him, it was amusing. Okay, so considering he was a Dark Lord, it should be hardly surprising that Sauron attempted genocide on multiple occasions. He had a long list of peoples that he hated: the Elves, the Númenóreans and their descendants in Gondor and Arnor. He hated the Northmen, he hated the Longbeard Dwarves. But despite this hatred, no matter how hard he tried, these groups survived him. But there's one group that Sauron was successful in genociding. They weren't even a group that had earned Sauron's hatred. Realistically, they were just collateral damage, which shows how callous Sauron could be. The group I'm talking about are the Entwives. In The Lord of the Rings, Treebeard laments their disappearance. They left the Ents, started their own gardens elsewhere, but when the Ents finally went to see them, they found their gardens destroyed and the lands barren. The Entwives have not been seen since. We actually mostly know the truth of what happened. In the Second Age, the Entwives had their gardens in the land south of Mirkwood, a land that would then become known as the Brown Lands, because they were barren, and Sauron was responsible. When the Last Alliance marched south to confront Sauron following his attack on Gondor, Sauron attempted to weaken them by staging forces in the Misty Mountains, but upon seeing the size of the Last Alliance, these soldiers refused to attack, and the Last Alliance got through unscathed. Thus, as they marched towards Mordor, Sauron made the strategic decision to rob them of a place of potential safe haven, a place where they could potentially resupply. His forces were directed at the gardens of the Entwives, and when the Last Alliance arrived, they found them destroyed, and no trace of the Entwives. I'm not going to pretend this decision doesn't make sense from a strategic point of view. The gardens could have been used by the Last Alliance, but it does show how cold and calculating Sauron could be. The gardens were presumably in the Brownlands for quite a long time, not far from Sauron and Mordor. He presumably could have destroyed them for many years, but he didn't, almost certainly not out of any goodness, but perhaps because they were irrelevant to him. He was not Morgoth, he did not destroy things just for the sake of it. What a compliment. But in that moment, a switch flipped in Sauron's mind and he went scorched earth. Neutral or not, the Entwives and any trace of their existence was completely wiped out. Assuming the Entwives were completely wiped out, they haven't been seen since. This had the consequence of dooming the Ents to a long, slow extinction. Alright, so all of these actions have been fairly logical, if you're an evil Dark Lord who doesn't care about being good. But sometimes Sauron's malice could backfire on him. The specific example I'll be talking about is during the War of the Elves and Sauron in the middle of the Second Age. Now before this war, the Númenóreans had made a port called Vinya Londe, later Lond Dare, at the mouth of the river Gwathlo in southern Eriador. This port was primarily used for shipping lumber back to Númenor, which was used to build more ships. This had the consequence of enraging the Gwathrim, the middlemen who lived in the forests of southern Eriador, and they saw the Númenóreans as environmental vandals who were destroying their homes. Enter the War of the Elves and Sauron. When Sauron invades Eriador, his primary focus is the Elves, but he does send some forces down the river Gwathlo to harass the Númenórean outposts there. Interestingly, Sauron's forces are welcomed by the Gwathrim. They see him as a way to drive the Númenóreans from their homes. But Sauron has no wish for this alliance, and instead orders his forces to burn the remaining forests in Enedwaith and Minhiriath. This is so thorough that even thousands of years later, both of those lands were completely deforested. The Gwathrim, their homes now completely destroyed, were forced to flee, either ending up on the coasts of Enedwaith or in Dunland at the foothills of the Misty Mountains. These men would later be known as the Dunlendings. There is some logic to this move. By burning the forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath, Sauron was robbing the Númenóreans of their main supply of lumber for their ships, but this move obviously had some consequences, both short-term and long-term. Firstly, it robbed Sauron of potential allies in the Gwathrim. While these men weren't particularly advanced, they were numerous and they knew the territory well. They had been actively resisting the Númenóreans for centuries now. and far from his own base in Mordor, these were the only potential allies Sauron had in Eriador. But in the end, Sauron decided that this alliance was worthless to him. He either simply did not care for the Gwathrim, viewing them as useless and primitive, or alternatively, he simply decided that burning the Númenórean lumber was worth more, and that the Gwathrim were perfectly acceptable collateral damage. Secondly, burning the woods ended up being not such a smart move, although to be fair to Sauron, he was expecting to win the war. When he lost, the Númenóreans found themselves ascendant in Middle-earth, but their primary port had now been rendered mostly useless. As a result, the importance of Vignalonde began to dwindle, and the Númenóreans instead started building strongholds and ports, places like Pelagir and Umbar, further to the south, closer to Sauron. So in the end, Sauron's disdainful treatment of the Gwathrim and their forests ended up harming him. He lost them as potential allies, and they were too weak to further resist the Númenóreans in the north, and it ended up causing the Númenórean sphere of influence to encroach upon his own dominions. Speaking of the Númenóreans, it would be wrong to end this video without Sauron's most insidious action of all, his corruption of Númenor. Now, Sauron had plenty of reasons to hate the Númenóreans. They had crushed him during the War of the Elves and Sauron, they had contested his dominion in Middle-earth, and nearing the end of the Second Age, King Ar-Pharazôn the Golden had humiliated him, taking him as a prisoner to Númenor. Unfortunately for Ar-Pharazôn, Sauron adapted to this, and he had a secret weapon, the One Ring, and only a few years later, Sauron had corrupted the king, and from there, began to corrupt all of Númenor. Honestly, this might be Sauron at his absolute worst, which is in direct contrast to the fair form he was wearing at the time. At first, he convinced the Númenóreans to completely turn away from Ilúvatar and the Valar, and instead worship Morgoth, the first Dark Lord who the ancestors of the Númenóreans actually fought against. He turned Morgoth worship into a religion, Melkorism. He had a giant temple built, and he basically became its high priest. Then, he managed to convince the Númenóreans to partake in awful practices such as slavery and human sacrifice. The human sacrifices were made to Morgoth for some reason, but in reality they had no practical purpose to Sauron other than to further degrade the Númenóreans and get rid of political enemies. We're also told that Sauron and his servants would wander the land, spreading lies, turning men against other men and against the king, literally because it was fun. Once again, Sauron's corruption of Númenor is another example of his own malice working against him. Sure, Númenor was Sauron's enemy, but Sauron was driven by revenge here, specifically against Ar-Pharazôn. Being the king's puppet master wasn't enough. Waiting for the king to die was not enough. No, Sauron had to convince him to attack Valinor, and eventually, Ar-Pharazôn caved in and did attack Valinor, leading to Númenor's destruction. Sauron laughed as Ar-Pharazôn set sail, but even he was dismayed when he saw Ilúvatar's response, and he lost his body in the downfall of Númenor. Although he and the One Ring would survive, he then lost his ability to take a fair form. The crazy thing about this is that when you consider Sauron's motivations, his desire to create a world of perfect order, you realize that he was so close. All he had to do was wait for Ar-Pharazôn to die, which was only a few years away, and the king didn't have an heir, so Sauron almost certainly could have just taken over as the immortal God King of Númenor. And if you wanted to perfectly order Middle-earth in accordance to your own vision, having the most powerful empire of men to ever exist under your command would be a great way to do it. In the end, Sauron threw it all away. Sure, he didn't know that Ilúvatar would literally unexist Númenor, but his burning desire for revenge, his hatred of Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans, caused him not to consider these consequences. I feel like there's a lot more I could say. This video could probably be an hour long because there's so many other moments, even if you don't include the constant wars, where Sauron was just terrible. Some honourable mentions, him feeding Beron's companions to werewolves one by one, when he deceived, betrayed, tortured, and then executed Celebrimbor, his enslavement of the 9 men who would eventually become the Nazgûl. So sure, perhaps he wasn't as chaotic evil as Morgoth, but that's a low bar to clear. To put it mildly, Sauron wasn't a nice guy. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I'll probably do another video talking about evil moments, this time for Morgoth. If you cover one Dark Lord, you may as well cover the other. And there's no shortage of absolutely diabolical things that Morgoth was responsible for. Cheers, farewell, and remember, don't be like Gorlim. Focus on the wording when receiving or making an offer, it might just save your life.